just to let you know. But I will set it up for recording now. Okay, so let me introduce Madeleine, Dr. Reeves, Dr. Madeleine Reeves, sorry. I am myself Dr. Gulzat Botayeva. I work at Roehampton University, a Central Asian scholar. And me and Diana Kudaibergenova, we were part of a bigger network, which I think started last year, which we informally call analytical and academic writing some support community. I'm also part of London Research Network that has been working in London, I think for the last 10 years at least. So I think in the last year, we have been trying to formalize a bit some of the activities that we have been doing. And we have invited with Diana, our friend and colleague Madeleine Reeves for today's Friday seminar, because we thought, there are quite a lot of talks about how to write a book or how to make a space, and how even to start thinking about it. And there are lots of different things. And we do know there are some events where, like, we are told about how to produce a book proposal or other kind of things. But this is more kind of an informal kind of chat mostly. Although Madeleine will be, I think, talking for 45 minutes, and then she will answer some of the questions and maybe to some of the comments. But our invitation was more like an informal invitation, and then that she can share her experience and some of the ideas around writing a book. So we're really pleased to see Madeleine joining us today. She's a senior lecturer in anthropology at the University of Manchester, as most of you probably know. And she's also the author of the award-winning book, Border Work, Spatial Lives of the State in Rural Central Asia, published by Cornell in 2014. And I do know that Madeleine is also writing another book at the moment. So I'll give the floor to Madeleine. So the housekeeping rules. Madeleine will talk for 45 minutes roughly, and then we will have a Q&A session. In total, we're hoping where the session will last for an hour and a half, but can go a bit longer, maybe up to 2 hours in total. And if you have any comments or questions, you can put them in chat, and me and Diana will gather them towards the end of Madeleine's talk. Okay? So, Madeleine.
Great, thanks so much, Gulzat and Diana, for the invitation. And I just want to recognize the amazing work that you both have done in fostering this Central Asian academic and analytical writing support community, which I've been kind of observing from a distance on Facebook. But I think it's just such a great example of the way in which, even in pandemic times, it's possible to create these sort of spaces of solidarity and sociality. And I think it's been really, really impactful for so many scholars. So if you work in or on or from Central Asia, and that sounds like it might be a forum that is useful for you, I do encourage you to check out their Facebook page and their monthly writing marathons. As Gulzat said, I'm a social anthropologist based at the University of Manchester. And in terms of sort of conceiving this talk, I can. This is sort of who I've pictured the talk for, right? So I've really pictured it primarily for an audience of scholars who are part of this Central Asian academic analytical writing support community, who are mostly PhD students, early career scholars, but by no means exclusively. And I'm really picturing an audience who are either working on or hoping to begin working on writing an academic book, perhaps having a stalled academic book project, perhaps in the sort of towards the end of that process, but finding yourselves sort of swamped by other commitments, because life doesn't stop for when we want to try and write a book. And I think one of the main challenges is trying to kind of find the pace, the rhythm, the momentum to work on a project of that size while doing so juggling other kinds of responsibilities. And I've listed here in brackets some of those that I know people in this community are involved in, whether that's teaching, activism, the contract research that's necessary to pay the bills, administration, all the caring labor that is intensified in pandemic times, applying for jobs and grants, given the nature of the academic job market, and very often other paid work, again, just to kind of, you know, keep things going. And there may be other sorts of responsibilities, obligations, demands on your time that you have. And I think it's really important to kind of acknowledge that up front, because I think a lot of writing advice is pitched at somebody who is in a relatively privileged position, who's got plenty of time to work on things, who's able to sort of really prioritize that. And I think that there are different kinds of obstacles and different kinds of challenges for making time for a big project when we're doing so, juggling multiple other commitments. And as I mentioned, I'm sort of directing this talk primarily at a community of scholars who work in or on or from or in some way connected with Central Eurasia. But I think about 80% of what I'm going to be talking about is more generally applicable to scholars hoping to progress work on books in the social sciences and humanities. So there'll be times at which I'm sort of referencing some of the particular challenges of pitching one's work as a scholar of Central Asia. But, you know, I think most of the comments will be fairly generic. But if you're planning to write a novel, this is probably not the talk for you. You're welcome to stay, but I'm thinking mostly about people who are working on sort of academic monographs, and very often in that process of trying to transition a dissertation into a published book. A little bit about me, and I want to mention this because I think these contextual things are important. I'm a social anthropologist. I also wear a number of other hats and have a number of other demands on my time, but I'm very aware that I work in a university system which gives sabbatical leave and which gives institutional recognition for academic research. And I'm extremely aware that that is not the case in many of the university systems in which members of this community work. So that even within relatively privileged university institutions in Central Asia, for instance, there isn't really a system of paid sabbatical leave, for instance. That just isn't a thing. And so actually then trying to find techniques to find ways to work on a book project in the midst of other commitments is also really important. I'm also in a discipline, social anthropology, that ascribes importance to academic monographs, for better or for worse, right? And again, this is something that will be different for different disciplines. Some disciplines attach much more importance to journal articles, and then writing a book may be something that becomes actually more of a sort of a way of producing a capstone project for a series of articles, or it may be something that you do just for your own sort of pleasure and fulfillment and to get the research out to a wider audience. But again, I think all of these sort of structural conditions of the labor that we conduct are really important to consider. And it's really important not to assume that somebody is located, say, in a privileged university system, or necessarily located in an institutional framework or a disciplinary framework that ascribes importance to academic monographs. And I guess one of the hats that I wear that has made me sort of really care a great deal and reflect a great deal about the obstacles and the challenges to getting published and specifically to getting books published is that I do a lot of supervising of doctoral dissertations and mentoring of postdocs, and trying to support doctoral students to apply for jobs and fellowships and so on. And I think very often one of the prime obstacles to getting a book published can sometimes be just the feeling that you've moved on to another project, right? Perhaps again, because of necessity, because you've finished a dissertation, you get a job on somebody else's project as a postdoc researcher, if you're lucky, and then actually carving time for your own monograph is squeezed. And again, there can be little sort of institutional or project recognition for that. So I think these conditions of academic sort of labor in which we work, ones which tend to prioritize these huge grants that employ multiple postdocs who then are essentially sort of contract researchers on somebody else's project, all mitigate against giving us the space and time to turn our dissertation research into books. So that's something that I'm interested in, I guess, at a sort of at a political level in terms of sort of institutional and academic politics. So this has maybe already given you a sense that this is not going to be a talk that is a sort of how to be more productive. In fact, these are some of my bugbears. I've put up here two examples of multiple examples that can be found online of the sort of masculinist, ableist, heroic forms of cajoling / encouragement to be more productive. There are many, many examples of these that can be found online. And although they can sometimes contain useful bits of information and useful bits of advice, my sense is that very often they have the effect of just reproducing a sense of being overwhelmed by the task at hand if one doesn't inhabit those same conditions of production. In other words, it sort of implies that if one were just a bit more motivated, if one just had a bit more willpower, then we could all write for 20 hours a week. You know, we could all prep less and, you know, write more, as Jason Brennan puts it. And I think, you know, you don't need me to talk through the ways in which the sort of the imperative language of this kind of advice, the ableism that it presupposes. I don't know how big the font has come up on your screen, but this is an example from the LSE. I think it's the LSE, one of the LSE blogs. I don't recall which one, but it's 6 academic writing habits that will boost productivity. And I just sort of cut and paste a section of that article, but it says, we recently carried out in-depth interviews with 23 scholars across the UK, Europe, and the US. We deliberately chose a diverse group so as not to make any assumptions based on age, seniority, or research background. But of course, by definition, if you're interviewing scholars only located in the UK, Europe, and the US, they're likely to be scholars that have, for instance, access to, you know, research support, potentially access to some kind of institutional recognition for research and so on and so forth. And that actually doesn't reflect the diversity of working conditions for people globally. The second example here, by Jason Brennan's, this was a sort of blog post that he wrote in 2016 on productive in publishing. You can easily find it online if you want to read the full version. I think there's some interesting sort of advice in here, but it doesn't actually help us, you know, how to find 20 hours a week in which to write. What does that actually consist of? What does one have to say? You know, what does one have to do to create the conditions for that? And I find that a lot of this advice, like I say, just tends to end up making us feel sort of in awe of the author who wrote this thing and their heroism for being able to write for 20 hours a week, but slightly sort of, it then can just reinforce that sense that, oh, well, I can't possibly do this. This can't possibly be for me, you know, because I don't have those, you know, skills to be able to write for 3 hours in the middle of the night, or to get up at 4 o'clock in the morning to be able to work on my book, etc., etc. So that's not what this talk is about. And I think there's been some really interesting work in the context of the pandemic, sort of really critically drawing attention to the language of productivity, indeed of hyperproductivity, in which sort of these kinds of techniques can reinforce, and instead the importance of asking different kinds of questions. There's a lovely blog, and I would recommend this to anyone, particularly graduate students, early career scholars, by Catherine Firth, called Research Degree Insiders. It's a very frank and well-crafted blog, and there's a lot of really interesting advice in there. And she had a post just last week questioning the logic and the language of productivity, particularly in pandemic times. So I think it's really important, again, to sort of think about the forms of sort of hyperproductivity in which the contemporary university tends to enroll us, and what to think about ways that we can hone writing as a craft, as a practice, as something that gives us satisfaction and a sense of creative sort of fulfillment, without being entrained into these sort of logics of that more and faster is necessarily better. Okay. And my other sort of problem with these tropes about sort of being more productive, how to be more productive as an academic writer, is that they seem to sort of imply that this is all basically a question of willpower or efficiency or finding hacks. And my sense is that the hacks are necessary but not sufficient. There's one particular hack that is worth a mention. I think it's, it's an example of something that is necessary but not sufficient, or a technique that may be useful in certain situations if you're trying to kind of create a little bit of focused time within the context of a busy day, which is this thing called the Pomodoro Technique. I'm not going to go into it in a great deal of detail. It's basically there on the visual, and there's a lot of information online about how to use this. But this is one example of a sort of a hack, a technique for finding a focused way of working on a task, giving yourself a very finite amount of time to work in a very concentrated fashion with all distractions removed, rewarding yourself with a break, repeating, and so forth. And it's a sort of a system for rendering one's time accountable to oneself, and for sort of carving out small, finite, feasible blocks of time. So a hack, right? My sense, though, is that very often advice about writing and writing books tends to stop there. It tends to stop with, the techniques, the hacks for kind of producing more time. And I think that ignores some of the often more foundational obstacles, either to getting started on a project, to getting started in the craft, the practice of writing, or to progressing a project once away, or once we sort of lose momentum. And perhaps more importantly, it doesn't address some of the foundational questions which are to do with the sort of the emotions, the affects, the sensibilities that we have when we are engaged in writing, and finding ways to channel our positive feelings towards writing, and to contain or mute or subdue the negative feelings that may surround the writing process. So I'll say a little bit more about those, and in a sense that's going to be the main focus of this presentation, partly because if you're interested in writing hacks and writing techniques, there's a lot of that stuff online, and there are many blogs devoted to that. But like I say, I think very often the hacks are necessary but not sufficient, and that what we really need to talk about are the kind of more structural things. Okay, so that's where I'm going to be focusing. Here are what I think are some of the main challenges and obstacles to getting started on a project, to getting stuck in. And I invite you to add in any other things that you think of, or that things that you are experiencing in your own writing practice. I'd encourage you to write those in the chat function. I can't see the chat function now because I've had my hosting privileges removed, but Gulzat or Diana will be monitoring that, and hopefully that can also be a sort of, things that we can address in the Q&A at the end. So here are some of the things. I think one of them, of course, is finding time to write regularly amongst other competing obligations. And I think if we, just from the sort of informal conversation that tends to happen in academic spaces or when we're in touch with each other, finding time to write regularly is often a challenge in itself. But I think it often also tends to then bring with it a whole series of emotional baggage that tends to get attached to that, right? That we not only, when we kind of complain to each other about, oh, I don't have time to write. It's also often overlaid with guilt, with embarrassment, with being late in delivering X, and all of that sort of sense that that we're failing somehow ourselves and potentially failing other people. Then I think there can be challenges about feeling out of touch with one's material, particularly if writing has stalled for a while, or particularly if, and I think again, this is a phenomenon of the contemporary university system, particularly as it affects early career scholars, is that you may have been deeply engaged in a dissertation project and then had to completely refocus your attention, your energy, and your time on a very different kind of project, perhaps sort of contract research. And then there can be this feeling of being out of touch with one's material, how to even reconnect with it. What if one's thinking has moved on in relation to the material? This can be compounded by a feeling of being sort of just overwhelmed by the size of the task at hand, right? That rather than, you know, an article which might feel more manageable, the whole task of sort of redrafting a PhD dissertation, which took huge amounts of intellectual and emotional labor, and particularly doing so when one's own thinking has moved on, when the empirical situation that one studied has moved on, when debates in the field might have moved on, there can be a sense of, oh my gosh, this task is too big to sort of undertake to begin. And then, of course, and this is particularly acute in the, you know, in the context of a global pandemic, there can be the challenges to finding the physical space in which to write, by which I don't mean just, you know, is there a library, a quiet room, or a cafe that you can go to, but is there the headspace? Is there the headspace to begin to sort of embark on tackling a new project or not tackling one? And I think one of the questions to, you know, to sort of address is in a sense, at what point is the right time to start working on a book or revising one's dissertation? And that, I think, is something that we can chat about in the Q&A. It might be that now isn't the right time. It might be that, you know, actually acknowledging, well, I've got these other things on, and being able to name those other things and diarize those other things to recognize the amount of time that they take may mean that one is more comfortable with saying, okay, I haven't got the time to change my dissertation into a book, or I'll do it in a different way than the way that I had originally envisaged. I'll do it in a way that demands relatively few revisions rather than relatively complex revisions and so forth. So I think these can be some of the sort of obstacles to getting started. And then I think there's also the sort of blocks to keeping a project going. And again, these are things that I think we perhaps don't tend to talk about enough in the context of our sort of academic, how do I go back? How do I go back? In academic conversations, right? That we can have concerns about whether our work will be relevant to publishers, whether our work will seem too dated by the time it actually appears, whether material based on research in Central Asia will speak to a wider audience, and how to pitch or revise one's work to make it speak to those wider debates. Questions often arise about what to do if one gets negative reviews. You know, will that be a barrier then to getting the text published? Will that mean that, you know, you'll never be able to work with a particular publisher again? And there can be sort of, I think, all these, again, these sort of affective and emotional components of working on a text, that one can just feel exhausted with it. One can sometimes just feel, you know, like, I'm just bored of this material, particularly after producing a dissertation, right? You know, so I think these are all things that we need to sort of talk about. I'm not here in the business of sort of giving quick fixes to any of these questions, because they will be extremely unique in each case. But one of the things I'm going to be talking about is finding a community of scholars or academic comrades with whom it's possible to have those conversations, and with whom it's possible to help decide, okay, am I too exhausted with this project that I actually just don't want to do anything with it? I might make my dissertation available open access so that other people can read it, but I don't want to turn it into a book manuscript. Or how, you know, how do I feel if I get a negative review? Will that make me not want to sort of touch my project again? Will it make me lose faith in it? How do I think about potentially updating the empirical materials so as to be able to update the story of the dissertation research into a book, or indeed the postdoctoral research that one did into a second monograph, because actually that's very often the career stage in which lives get consumed by teaching, administration, examining, sitting on committees, and there can often be a huge gap there between sort of the research one did as a postdoctoral researcher and trying to turn that into a book. So this isn't just relevant to the gap between doctoral research and a first book. So I think it's really important that we have conversations about the sort of the doubts and the questions that we have about our project. So in terms of addressing these, like I said, I'm not going to be suggesting quick fixes, but I do think there are four broad areas for thinking about how we might address these different kinds of obstacles. And in a sense, this and the next slide are the main kind of, in a way, take homes from this presentation. I think we can think about addressing these obstacles in terms of four broad areas. Firstly, questions of habits and techniques. So developing writing habits that don't demand, as Jason Brennan said, writing for 20 hours a week, but habits and techniques that allow us to find 20 minutes here or 20 minutes there, or even 10 minutes here or 10 minutes there, to be able to keep connecting with our project over the long duration. Then there are questions to do with developing the structures and the community, the structures of accountability and the community of what I'm calling sort of critical friends, critical readers who can help to give constructive critical feedback on one's work, and sort of thinking about techniques to cultivate that community of scholars and comrades in writing who can provide feedback and with whom one can address those questions, those doubts, those uncertainties, and share suggestions, and with whom one can share drafts, share draft book prospectuses, share draft chapter abstracts, and so forth. So thinking about how to develop structures and community. A third set of responses and ways of addressing these obstacles is to think about the information that we need and the contacts that we might need to begin to envisage the text in our head as a finished book, as a book in a bookstore with a cover that somebody can go and buy or find in a library and read, right? What might be the techniques that one needs to adopt, the actions that one needs to take to find the information about whom to contact, which presses to contact, how to get the information about the contacts one may need to cultivate in order to kind of do that work of envisaging a text as a book. And then there are responses that are to do with our feelings and our attitudes about writing. And I have to say that personally, this last one is, for me, the most important one. Or put it like this: we can develop habits and techniques, right? We can develop hacks. We can find sort of information about, how to, use the Pomodoro technique to be able to write more. We can find, I think, those sort of communities of accountability, I think, more easily now with sort of the availability of online communities, and the Central Asian academic and analytical writing community, I think, is a really great example of that, of a community of solidarity that may just be a couple of people. It may just be a couple of people who are also trying to work on books, with whom one can share questions and chapter drafts and so on. One can relatively easily find now information online about different presses, about the books that they publish, about how to contact series editors, about how to contact commissioning editors, about the kind of the formal process of addressing a press, right? But the fourth one, the question of sort of our feelings and our attitudes, is, I think, often at the, it's often the foundation for the other things to be able to happen in the first place, right? If we're fundamentally feeling sort of exhausted, disillusioned, ambivalent, and perhaps worse, embarrassed about our research, or ashamed about the fact that it's taken us so long to try to approach writing a book. I think if those things are all if our feelings towards writing and feelings towards the process of approaching book writing are full of sort of self-doubt and self-criticism, then the other stuff becomes much harder to address, right? So that the sort of the feelings and the attitudes bit, I feel, is kind of foundational. And I'm, again, as a mentor and as a supervisor, I'm also really interested in this. I'm really interested in trying to support doctoral students who encounter moments of writing block, who experience moments of profound sort of doubt about whether they can complete their project and so on. And there's been some really interesting work on this. It's not something, okay, I've got another slide, okay. It's not something that I have done research on myself, but there's a wonderful scholar called Helen Sword, who's done some really sort of serious empirical research about people's attitudes and feelings towards writing. And I've put here a quote that addresses this question from her book with a lovely title, Air and Light and Time and Space, How Successful Academics Write. And she notes this, what she calls these mixed emotions that the people that she interviewed dozens of scholars at different career stages about their relationship to academic writing and their, about their writing habits, but also about their feelings about writing. And she found, as she says, that about 70% of my survey respondents across a range of demographic categories reported that they associate both positive and negative emotions with their academic writing. At the margins of the data, however, a somewhat different picture emerged. At every academic career stage, from PhD student to full professor, the female academics expressed higher percentages of negative-only emotions, and that was even more striking among PhD students. So this question of the sort of the feelings that we have about writing, I think are things that we don't talk about enough. And I hope that we can maybe have a conversation about that in the Q&A. I'm going back a slide now. I hope that I can. No, that's going the wrong way. Here we go. So if I go back to the four sort of areas, right? The four areas that these obstacles, the four areas to address, to think about these obstacles: habits, techniques, structures, community, information, contacts, feelings, attitudes. I think then we can further break these down into a series of practices. And I've got here 9 of them, with a 10th, which is a kind of virtuous feedback loop between the other ones. But I've tried to sort of identify these as a series of kind of techniques that allow us to address those 4 areas on the preceding slides. So firstly, and these are things that I'm going to be talking about in the rest of my time: cultivating healthy writing habits and routines, turning a massive book project into manageable sections, so to address that question of feeling overwhelmed by the size of the project, developing a community of accountability and finding critical readers, some of whom may overlap with that community of accountability, but that may extend to include people like one's former supervisor, book series editor, scholars in your field whose work you admire, people that you might want to turn to say, would you mind having a look at my book prospectus? Or would you mind having a look at these chapter drafts? Would you mind giving feedback on this particular chapter, and so forth? Then techniques to envisage the text as a particular kind of book, becoming aware of one's own scholarly voice. And then the last 3 are really to do with this attitudinal and emotional aspect of writing. So acknowledging writing as affectively charged labor, finding ways to say no to other commitments without regrets, and finally making imposter syndrome one's friend. And so that's what I'm going to be sort of running over in the next little bit of the talk. So on the emotional side, I've mentioned Helen Sword's research. Here are some of the things, the emotions that I think writing may be associated with. This is absolutely anecdotal on my part, and some of it is very personal, right? Some of the things that I experience when I'm feeling negative about writing, right? I may feel embarrassed about, oh my goodness me, this data is so old now. This material, you know, is it really worth it? Do I have anything interesting to say? We may feel shame about kind of being late with delivering a project, with finishing a book that we'd hoped to finish. Perhaps, you know, embarrassment that we'd let somebody down who had mentored our project and we haven't, you know, sort of delivered by producing a book. There can be all sorts of other things: boredom, exhaustion, fear, sometimes feelings of anger if we've had negative reviews and we feel that our work has been really challenged or undermined in some sense. And all of these things potentially can be quite debilitating to kind of actually re-engaging with our work creatively and with care. Some of those negative emotions may themselves be quite mobilizing. Sometimes feeling that you've had a negative review can be the thing that makes you spur to go, hang on, I'm just going to damn well show reviewer too that I have something interesting to say. But I think sometimes those things can also be paralyzing. Sometimes a negative review can make us go, oh my gosh, I need to just, you know, to really lose faith in our project. And then, of course, there can be all the positive emotions with which writing may be associated, right? Anticipation, pleasure, curiosity, excitement, a sense of purpose and identity as a writer. And I know in my own case, speaking very personally here, that I would say more often I feel negative feelings. Writing elicits negative feelings for me rather than positive ones. And I'm also aware that this is something that emerged at a particular time for me, right? When I was a kid, I used to love writing. In fact, I dug out, for the purpose of this presentation, a project that I did when I was about 12 years old, which was about sugar. And I remember kind of the joy and the pleasure that I took in sort of producing this project and going to the library and finding some books. And kind of writing felt like it was an expression of my creative identity, right? And I think probably all of us who are in academia can probably, I'm going too fast again, relate to a time when we had that sense of writing as a sort of creative expression of our identity. And then very often at some point, something changes, right? And in analyzing what changes and how we might address that, I think there's sort of certain things that we need to acknowledge. One is that writing is a craft that can be practiced. And I think, you know, as kids, we're okay about making mistakes. We know that we're not expected, it's not expected to be perfect, that our writing isn't going to be, you know, perfect, and so on and so on. And I think very often then when we sort of enter an academic space, there can be this feeling that sort of, we ought to know all the rules of the game. We ought to know how it works. We ought to know already how to craft a book-length manuscript. So I think, first of all, thinking about writing as a craft that can be practiced, that can be honed, that can be done in short little bits, right? Just like, you know, practicing a study on a musical instrument can be. And recognizing that it requires certain material conditions of production, but it does require a certain amount of personal discipline and desire, and to recognize that it's effectively charged. I think these are things can be useful to sort of reconnect with that space of writing as something that gives us pleasure or purpose or a sense of identity, or at least, at the very least, that helps to tame and keep under control the negative emotions that can surround writing, which I think can so often be quite overwhelming. And one of the things that comes from, you know, a lot of the research that has been done with people who write regularly and who write well and who've published a lot, is that the inspiration tends to come from the act of doing it, right? From the practice of the craft comes the inspiration rather than the other way around. And I like sort of thinking about writing as craft, because as Richard Sennett says, it sort of directs attention from questions of sort of inspiration, of sort of waiting for something to come from the outside, to the way in which sort of slow, regular practice of a technique can itself produce that sense of satisfaction, the sense of fulfillment, the sense of sort of enjoying working on something for its own sake. And again, this is important for me because I think if we can reconnect with writing as something that intrinsically gives us pleasure, it's much easier then to find those habits whereby we want to sort of try to write every day. It will feel less like it's something that is sort of onerous, or something that we're doing out of a sense of sort of duty or compulsion, and instead something that we want to do. Next, I think, in terms of this work of writing as craft, is having a sense of what works for us, for you, in your current circumstances in terms of that labor of production, right? By which I mean, again, instead of saying, write 20 hours a week, all, come what may, and let everything else go by the wayside, I think much better to start with an honest reckoning of, okay, what are the things in my week that I cannot move? What are the times of day when I know that there is no way, with the best will in the world, that I will be able to write, either because I've got other obligations, or because at that time in the day, I just can't do creative, intellectual, demanding work. And I think sort of starting with that reckoning, and with a reckoning of one's diary, can help direct attention to, okay, what might be 2 chunks of 25 minutes a day when I might be able to get some writing done, or 1 chunk of 25 minutes, or indeed 1 chunk of 10 minutes. In my own day at the moment, I know that from 4 o'clock in the afternoon till about 9 o'clock in the evening, I can't get any work done. I'm looking after my child, I'm cooking, etc., right? So I know that my sort of working day begins at 9 in the morning and ends at 4 in the afternoon. And sometimes there's a little bit of give in the evening, if I'm lucky and if I've got the energy. But I know that I can't do any creative writing work in the evening, for instance. I just know I'm just fighting myself if I try to do that. So I think sort of thinking about the when, and some of the useful advice that comes up in these sort of writing manuals is to recognize those times and spaces that are not necessarily big extended chunks of time, but might be little pockets of time between other activities, when one might just be able to reread something that one wrote and write, another little paragraph, or reconnect with the work that one was writing yesterday and edit it, or check a few bibliographic references, or look up an article. So just that little work of kind of checking in with one's project, reconnecting with it. And I think that's important because, first of all, those little chunks of time can add up to lots of chunks of time. Secondly, the big chunks of time often never come around, or come around at a point when we're so exhausted that all we want to do is sort of put our feet up and, drink a tequila. And thirdly, because those little chunks of time help us to sort of they stop the project from becoming something in our mind that is huge and overwhelming and out of control, and it becomes something that we can just check in with and just sort of reconnect with. Then there are the questions of where and with whom. The where, of course, in the context of pandemic is one that, we're all like, working in strange places and unideal circumstances. But I know, if I think in my own experience of the time that was the best writing time for me ever, it was when I was a graduate student, and I used to take myself to the room that's pictured here, which was the East Asian reading room of the university library, the University Library in Cambridge. And it was great because I couldn't read any of the books on the shelves. And there was no Wi-Fi, at least at the time that I was working there. This was a good while ago. I suspect it's different now. But the fact that there wasn't any Wi-Fi in this room was really, really disciplining, because it meant that I sort of worked in chunks of time, and then would go off and, check my emails. This was just the beginning of social media days, but it sort of created this sort of demarcated space so that when I went into that room, I could literally, it was like a sort of Pavlovian dog reaction, that as soon as I entered that room and smelt the kind of smell of the books, it was like, oh, right, okay, I'm in working mode. Now, of course, reconstituting that in our own circumstances is not straightforward. But I think if we can develop habits of the sort of the where we write, right? And telling the people that we live with, who might be, you know, noisy and distracting, that, you know, when I'm in this particular time, or if I'm going to this particular room or whatever, I need this little bit of time to work. I need these protected 25 minutes just to be able to write, right? So it's also about working with the people around us to create the circumstances for sort of producing that. And then I think the whole question of which distractions in abeyance is really important. The author Zadie Smith insists that, you know, you should write with your computer disconnected from the internet. Now, personally, I know that I couldn't do that because so much of my academic writing is also, you know, checking something along the way, checking a quote, looking something up. But I do think it's worth sort of identifying for ourselves, what are the things that distract us in the process of writing? For me, I know that it's the ping of an email, right? It's the ping of my Outlook that kind of sets off the, again, the trigger in my head that says, you've got to go and check your email. This might be something urgent. So finding little ways to, you know, turn off the notifications on your phone, turn off the email pings, things like that, again, for these protected chunks of time, so that this becomes sort of demarcated protective time. I think that can be useful. Virginia Woolf talked about the cream of the morning brain, right? But for each of us, that may be a different time of day. Some people write best at night, some people in the afternoon. It's a matter of knowing what works for you. And again, within that context, finding what could be those chunks of time that you know, you can carve off. Yeah, rationing social media and other distractions. I don't need to go, I mean, again, there's a huge amount of stuff about this online, but, you know, again, finding what works for you, but I think finding ways to abate distractions. Okay, there's a lot of stuff, again, available, a lot of information, some of it more helpful, some of it less helpful, about writing targets. And again, I think very often these have the effect of making us feel that we're doing something, you know, that we can't uphold our own ideals and our own goals. I think it's about finding targets that work for you. And I want, because I'm conscious of time, to just tell you about one that I think is a really interesting method. And you can look it up. It's called the Yahtzee Method. Yahtzee spelled Y-A-H-T-Z-E-E. And it's so called because of a game called Yahtzee that involves rolling a dice. That's not important. What's significant about it is that it's a system that has variable targets, so that instead of saying, okay, every day I'm going to try and write 500 words, and then, you know, a bit like with anything, a couple of days in, we sort of feel that we're failing. What it allows you to do is to have variable targets, so that one day you can cross off, I've written 100 words today. The next day you might be able to write 1,000 words. But if you have a series of sort of targets that allow you to mark off different quantities of words or time spent, you can have a feeling of sort of satisfaction and of having worked towards your goal, even with relatively small incremental increases in a project. And it also recognizes then the fact that our working days are not equal, that some days we may be able to work more intensively on something and some days less. I won't say more than that. There's other sort of suggestions there on the slide, but there's a very useful YouTube video which lays out this Yahtzee method in more detail. And certainly that's something that I have found quite useful in trying to kind of keep track of how much I'm writing each day, but to do it in a way that doesn't presuppose that every day I'm going to be able to write a set amount. Other things, and this relates to the question of sort of targets, is thinking about the book also in manageable chunks, which may be significantly smaller than a chapter. And this is, I think, particularly useful if you're at an early stage of a project where you're trying to sort of figure out the arguments, figure out the ideas, figure out the structure, is to really start with kind of chunks of text, by which I mean it might be sort of a chunk of empirical material that we want to work with, and then building from that to the chapter as a whole, rather than trying to draft a chapter in great detail, or indeed draft a whole book manuscript in great detail, and then to sort of fill in the gaps. So to start with a section, something that perhaps grabs you from your empirical material, something that you feel is a compelling story, perhaps an important ethnographic vignette if you're working with ethnographic material, and then to sort of build up from that. Think about the theoretical tools that are necessary to unpack that, and then build towards that to the larger structure, rather than sort of starting with the macro structure and starting from page 1, and then very often sort of losing momentum partway through, particularly if we're trying to work on the big picture arguments when we're still actually trying to figure out what those are. To sort of to start with the empirics, to start with the specifics, and then the big picture arguments will often sort of emerge from the process of sort of analyzing from the material upwards, rather than kind of starting with the larger structure. I add a proviso there that will be more true for some disciplines than others. I think, you know, if you've got a very hypothesis testing type discipline, that won't necessarily be the case for you. You might have a very, very organized structure to start with. But if you're working from more ethnographic type materials, I think that may be often a generative way. Okay, the next little bit of advice relates to this question of community. And I think this is so important, to be able to find people who can, first of all, be a listening ear about all the emotional stuff that surrounds writing, but secondly, who can be that kind of community of accountability, who can help to give deadlines, who can help to motivate someone to carry on writing. Sometimes these communities literally sort of meet face to face to write in a kind of co-presence virtually, so that you have that sense that, okay, someone else is trying to churn out words on a page at the same time as me. But more generally, I think these sort of communities of accountability and support can be so important in helping one to navigate the publication process, in terms of getting feedback on drafts, in helping talk through an argument, to get a sense of sort of having an argument articulated verbally, so as to help with the writing process. There can be lots of ways of doing that. You know, I mean, the example that I gave with the group that is hosting this talk is a good one. But I think within our own networks, it's possible to find other people who are also working on the early stages of a book manuscript, or also trying to finish a book, or also struggling with trying to create space to work on a book within the context of other obligations. And just having somebody that you can check in with regularly, whether that's a larger community or just another individual, can, I think, be very, very motivating to keep on track with something, and to sort of remind oneself why it is that this matters, you know, and why, you know, that sometimes I find that, you know, realizing that, oh, my project matters to somebody else is sort of motivating for me, you know, and I certainly find that with my PhD students, that, you know, a good supervision is one where the student comes away feeling energized, that, oh, okay, now I'm reminded why I want to keep working on this. So finding that community, I think, is important. And then we get to the whole question of sort of coming to envisage your text as a published book. And I think this is so important to being able to turn that text into a book, and to sort of go through all the processes that are needed. You have to be able to sort of envisage it. And I think a good place to start there is to sort of think about, what's the kind of book that I love, you know, in your field. It may be quite empirically distant from the stuff that you're working on, but something about the sort of the organization of the book, the style of the book, the tone of the book, how it's written, how they work with their ethnographic or empirical material. It might be something about the aesthetics of the book, how they present their argument. It might be something about how they write, to whom they write, the style in which they write, the kind of tone in which they write. And I think sort of really spending time thinking about the sort of the craft of book production, as opposed to the craft of getting text onto a page, but actually thinking about, how did this author make the kind of choices that they made about the organization of the material, how they placed the theory as in relation to the empirics, how, if at all, they decided to update the material in a conclusion, how they sought to reach audiences beyond their specific discipline or the people working in their particular area. I know in my own field there are certain texts that I come back to again and again as sort of exemplars. And I think sort of really analysing that, and then analysing that in your own case, in terms of your audience, in terms of what that audience is assumed to know, and what implications that has then for how you go about organising your text, is really important. And again, these are things that your community, your community of sort of critical readers and solidarity can hopefully help with. They can point you to those exemplar texts. They can tell you when your tone or your style of writing is too convoluted, too full of jargon, when your sentences are too long, and so on and so forth. So that work of sort of picturing the text as a book, I think, is important. And that also means being quite specific, right? So really doing this work at the level of thinking about particular series that you might want your book to be published in, particular presses that you might want your book to appear in. And most academic presses will have catalogues of their recent books, and these are really, I think, good places to start with, to sort of think about, okay, is there a particular style or approach that is appreciated by this particular publisher? I don't have time here to go into much about the sort of differences between different publishers, but there'll be different publishers that in your particular field have reputations for publishing a particular style or kind of book, a particular length of book, even at a very basic level, right? There's no point pitching a text to a publisher and saying, I've got this wonderful 500-page manuscript, when they will never publish a book that is longer than 80,000 words, for instance. So these very, very basic considerations. But this background work about the sort of the craft of the text as book, I think, is equally important as the background work on the sort of the craft of writing itself. And again, this can be something that if you don't have much time to sort of work on the book in the sense of churning out text, can be useful in reconnecting and connecting and keeping connected with the project. In, if you've got a 5-minute break somewhere, to just look through some of the presses that you like, some of the series that you like, think about the recent texts that they've published, think about how you might be able to pitch your manuscript so that it fits in with their existing list, because that ultimately is what presses tend to be interested in. A few little things here I think to be particularly wary about regarding dissertations. We can talk about this more in the Q&A, and I know that this was something that came up in the questions that were posed to the group beforehand. Be really wary about just publishing your dissertation unrevised. Publishers tend not to like that. And again, it tends not to, that a dissertation is intended for a really different audience than a published book. So it's worth taking the time to really sort of think about how you might revise a dissertation to address a different audience. How might the tone be different? How might the style be different? How might the positioning of theory within the text be different? And I think one of the things that general piece of advice I would give to doctoral students is to avoid trying to get your text out as quickly as possible, unless that's what is useful and necessary for you, right? It might be that you want to get your book out really quickly because it's very contemporary material. You don't want to spend lots of time revising it. You want to move on to the next thing. Fine. But I would say, don't publish a text just because your supervisor is saying, I think you should publish this text in a series that I edit. Definitely avoid presses that are asking you to pay them to publish your work. Avoid predatory publishers or publishers that presses that want you to pay to publish. And consult, chat to people in your field. Again, think about the texts that are really influential for you. And then I think there's a whole series of sort of things to think about in terms of drafting a prospectus. And again, we could have a whole session on drafting a prospectus, and I think there may even have been a talk on this, so I won't go into this in a lot of detail. My main advice is have a look at the different publishers that you want to consider as a venue for your book, and look at their specific guidelines. They will usually have pretty clear guidelines online. This is from University of California Press, where they've got a very clear sort of sequence. And note that you can send the acquisitions editor a preliminary query about your project. And this is useful, this can be useful even at a relatively early stage of drafting the manuscript, to gauge whether they have interest, to gauge whether this is something that they would be potentially interested in for one of their lists. And they may already have sort of steers for you at that stage. It may be that they say, well, potentially we're interested in this, but we'd want you to bring in a comparative case, or we'd want you to update the material, which, you know, may or may not work for you. So it's useful to sort of have those preliminary inquiries with commissioning editors relatively early in the process. And of course, for that purpose, it's important to develop your elevator pitch, your sense of what it is that is specific about your perspective, your insight, your backgrounds, your positioning within the scholarly field, that means that your text is going to be one that they would want for their lists. I'm getting towards the end here, but I just want to give a little case study. And this is a case study for of 3 books in my own sort of research area, 3 recent publications, which all have to do with labor migration in the post-Soviet space. And I'm mentioning them here because I want to big up all of these 3 authors, Sofia Kasimova, Aiko Kulmaksutova, and Rustam John Urinboyev, all of whom I think have produced really amazing pieces of scholarship. But I'm mentioning them here because the authors have chosen 3 quite different publication strategies. And I'm not saying that one is necessarily better than the other, but I am saying that as a scholar, one of these texts, Rustam John's, which is published open access with University of California Press, is extremely easy for people to access. It's free. It's listed on Amazon, .com. It's easily searchable in Google Books. Aiko Kul's book, which I read recently, I think is an amazing piece of scholarship. It was really quite tricky to track down this book. And that's, for me, as someone who's sort of interested in this field, and it wasn't available on Amazon. Google Books doesn't include a picture of the cover. The website that I ordered it from is only in German, etc., etc. And Sofia's book, which is, again, I think an amazing piece of scholarship, really, really detailed. For those who don't read Russian, it's about gendered aspects of migration in Tajikistan, published in Dushanbe. And of course, that means that the text reaches an audience in Tajikistan, and it's published in Russia. And that's, I think, very important. So I'm not saying that one of these publishing strategies is better than the other. I'm just saying that in terms of the visibility of the work, it was quite challenging I mean, Irfan doesn't have, as I can tell, its own website. It was very difficult to order a copy commercially. I ended up having to order a copy directly from Sofia, and so on and so forth. So I think my main point here is thinking about finding the press that is right for you, for the audience that you want to reach. And again, finding that community of scholars who can help you to make that decision. Okay. And then my final point is about honing and valuing your voice. There's so much that could be said here. And again, we could have a whole session on here just about this. But I think it's really important to know and to have an awareness about your positionality within the field. There is a lot of critique that can be made. And the slide that I've got on the left here is about the very imbalanced field of knowledge production in one notorious case of an anthropology journal that may or may not be relevant to many of the people in this webinar. So I won't go into it in detail. You can find stuff online. This reference here to the footnotes blog, I think, is very useful. But I think being aware of one's positionality and the perspective that brings is really important in pitching a text to a publisher. And what is equally important is thinking about how one can sort of also link one's own specific arguments, whether that's about sort of the particular empirical research that one is doing, or the particular kinds of critique that one is articulating from one's positionality, to sort of think about how that can be used to engage critically larger arguments in one's field, because that again is what sort of publishers are going to be interested in. So they're going to be interested in how does this perspective, whether from one's positionality, whether one's the kind of critique one's articulating, whether because of the particular empirical material, whether because of the kinds of insight that emerges because of one's knowledge of particular regional languages and so on, how does that help to critique and challenge some of the kind of conventions in one's field? I think that's a really sort of important intervention that to kind of keep in mind for publishers. Okay, I'm going to sort of wrap up here. There's a lot that could be said about citation, and to use and to be aware of how we can reference each other's work in ways that also promotes and celebrates that work. I'm just going to end with a couple of things about the importance of saying no to stuff, because writing a book also demands recognizing that working on that will mean probably saying no to other stuff. And that comes back to the point that I made at the beginning, that it's important to recognize when is the right time for you in your career, but also in terms of your other commitments, to be working on this project. And that may or may not be now, right? And that it's okay to say no to other commitments. And if that's challenging, find ways, and this was extremely challenging for me, find ways of cultivating ways of saying no that aren't necessarily outright rebuffals, but are ways of saying thanks, but right now I can't do that because I'm working on this other thing. And I've made the point at the end here that making time for writing was and still is a feminist issue. This is a point raised in the classic A Room of One's Own by Virginia Woolf already a century ago. And it still is. It still is because of the inequalities in the ways that service work tends to be allocated within institutions. It is because of the imbalances in the way that caring work within the family is distributed and allocated. You know, you don't need me to tell you this, I'm sure, but I think it's important to kind of recognize and acknowledge that, and to acknowledge that actually making time to work on one's book does mean imposing boundaries around it, and recognizing that that requires having times when one is not available for other kinds of work, right? Recognizing that, you know, making sure that colleagues are aware of that, but also potentially that other family members are aware of that. What are the times that you need to be able to carve off space to be able to work on something without distraction, without having to answer the phone, without having to look after the kids, and so forth. And last but not least, remember that some reviewers are jerks, and a good editor will know that, and that good scholarship is often slow burn. I think there is, as I said at the beginning, this celebration of hyperproductivity, of overproductivity, of speed, and so much of the sort of writing advice tends to start from that presumption. Go back to your constructive critical readers and trust that you have something to bring to the table. And if people don't give you a seat at the table, as Shirley Shisham famously put it, bring yourself a folding chair. That's me done. Thank you very much. Happy Nowruz, everybody, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Madeleine. Oh, it's a lot of stuff, I think. I haven't been looking at the chat, so I think Diana might have been looking after the chat. If Diana is here. Diana.
Yes, sorry, I'm here. Sorry, my internet is really sucking. Okay. Okay, we have a number of questions. Is that why you called? Okay, yeah. Sorry. Oops. Confused. Okay, so people asking, what if someone else has published an almost exact version of my book just before I submit my monograph? What's going to happen?
You want me to start off with that, or do you want to gather a number of questions?
Yes, I think we can do like 3 or 4 questions, and maybe people can voice them themselves if they want to, starting from the beginning.
Okay, and I have, because I also received some confidential questions as well. So how do you want to go about it? I put them all in the document, in the Word document that I have.
Okay.
So the first 3 is what if somebody published something exactly like my manuscript? Second is it more strategic to focus on journal articles, especially if I want to get a postdoc funding, and the book takes longer to write. So what would be your take on publishing for early career scholars? What's the strategy, journals or article, journals or book? And the third question is, what if you don't have a book yet and you're already in the middle of your career? Do you think, you know, what is it okay? But I share my time between research and civil society project. So yeah, all the questions really about
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, great questions. So the first one, what if someone's already has just published a book and you're like, oh, damn, that was, they've taken my arguments or they've taken my material. I think the first thing to say here is that in most of the work, most of the work that we're doing is going to be based on empirical material that is unique to us and that is distinctive to us. So it may be that someone is publishing something that is pretty close to the kind of stuff that you're working on, right? I mean, I could give an example. I referenced Rustam Urinboyev's book, right, which I have blurred. The stuff that I'm working on has many overlaps. I can hold it up here. I think it's a great book. It's written from a different sort of disciplinary perspective. And although there's a lot of overlap, I can also say, okay, well, there are things in which coming at this from a different sort of theoretical perspective, coming from it with slightly different empirical material means that we're actually in conversation with each other, and that's okay. So I think, it can feel perhaps, inhibiting, and at worst it might feel sort of threatening, and somebody can respond with, stepping on one another's toes. But actually, I think if you can change that around and say, actually, this shows that there's an interesting anthropological or scholarly conversation that needs to happen around this phenomenon. And very often publishers will be excited by that. They won't necessarily see that as sort of duplication or as, this means that this thing won't sell. It means that they probably are saying, oh, okay, this thing, I don't know, the Anthropocene, or there's a dozen books appearing about Uber, for instance, right, as a social phenomenon. Well, of course, there weren't books about Uber 10 years ago. That means it's a thing. It's an empirical phenomenon that that people are sort of engaging with. So I think it's important to be aware of that, and sort of when you write a sort of a pitch to a prospective publisher to show that that there's other stuff out there in the field. But I don't think it should be a reason not to write. The next two questions about whether one should focus on journal articles or a book, and whether one should write a book sort of midway through one's career. In one sense, these are going to be questions that are discipline, that are different by discipline, and that are going to be specific to the sort of the individual and their institutional location. This comes back to the having that sort of community of support with whom you can have those specific conversations about your specific situations. But in general, I think there will be disciplines where journal articles are what matter for getting you a job. I said at the beginning that anthropology is one of those disciplines where a book is often seen as important to be able to, certainly in the UK context, get a permanent job, not necessarily a first job. But there are many disciplines where that's not the case. So I think it is important about being aware of what is, strategic in your discipline. But it's also about that question of, do you want to turn your dissertation into a book? Do you feel that it hangs together as a book? Do you feel that there's enough do you want that canvas that is larger than that of a journal article? And those will be very, very personal questions. And I think that comes back, the same applies to the mid-career scholar. Is it worth writing a book midway through one's career? Well, yes, if you feel that there's something in that material that still has value and you want to get it out into the world. And I think that there are ways in which books travel and circulate and retain value within the academic community more than journal articles do. I frequently go back to Caroline Humphrey's monograph written in 1982 on Karl Marx Collective, right? I don't think I would be doing that to a journal article that was written in 1982, because there's something about the canvas, the scope of the argument, and the depth of the ethnographic material in that case that gives it lasting weight. So it has to also be a question of there has to be an element, this comes back to the question of desire. There has to be a point at which you say, I just want to get, I want this thing to live in the world. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that. There was an anonymous question about from a cultural and social anthropologist who is asking about what to do with the pandemic times and how to do the fieldwork, because the question is about whether to prolong fieldwork into post-pandemic times and get more impersonal field data, or to try to work with adjusted methodology and finish and publish work right away. And then repeat the research on another level once the pandemic is over. And this is also dealing with pressures of being the PhD student at the moment. So
And two more questions.
maybe, yeah. Yeah, and two more. They're not quite related, but it's also, both of them are quite anonymous. So do you want me to ask unrelated questions, or do you want to address this one quickly and then move on to?
I don't mind. I mean, I think that this is a really important question, and whoever is addressing it, whoever is posing this question, you are not alone. I mean, I have PhD students currently, and you know, who are absolutely in this dilemma. And again, I think it comes back, the person asking the question mentioned that they were in social and cultural anthropology, where in a sense, the bedrock of how we generate knowledge is through intersubjective contact with other human beings. And of course, that you know, there are ways in which that can happen online, as we are doing currently, but there are also a whole series of respects in which that is very limiting for the kind of holistic interaction that we derive from doing ethnographic fieldwork. I don't want to give any sort of prescriptive answer there, because I think there are so many individual circumstances, not least, you know, whether one has funding that can be put on hold, whether one has the domestic circumstances to be able to postpone fieldwork and so on, that will mean that these questions have to be answered individually with one's supervisor. But I would say, again, it comes back to this, you know, having your academic support community, because if you're not getting that support from your academic advisors or supervisors in the institution where you are, then that community can be very, very valuable for generating that. But I think in general, I would say when it comes to anthropological fieldwork, my intuition is to say it's better to postpone that until such a time as one can actually generate that kind of fieldwork insight, because unless one's doing a very specific kind of project that translates easily online, I fear that it would end up just prolonging a project that might be better sort of interrupted. But I think these are very, very, you know, they're going to be specific to each project, each institutional sort of setup, each individual circumstance.
Great, thank you so much. There are two questions that also came out anonymously. We know that your fantastic book, one of my favorites, is published by the Cornell University Press, the Border Work, and the person was actually thinking of sending their book there as well, and they were asking what was your experience and if you can share some of the insight. And I'm not sure if it's okay to do it when we record it. And then another question came anonymously as well from the it's about positionality, and the person is asking about your thoughts or advice about the feelings of perhaps, and this is under the question mark, shame or colonial guilt that scholars who are not from Central Asia may feel when writing about Central Asia. And it's the feeling, if to paraphrase, and I'm quoting here, comedian Bob Newhart, that I shouldn't even be doing this because of who I am, where I'm from. But if my work does or does not, you know, belong to this world, especially people in populations I'm writing about. So it's more of a question of positionality.
Yeah,
quite personal. Thank you for all these questions.
Yeah, great questions. Okay, so on the Cornell process specifically, whoever it is, I'd be, you know, happy to chat to you off camera. And, you know, again, this is what these communities are for, right? Is to be able to share that experience. And for anybody here who's thinking of, you know, sending a manuscript to a particular press, if you've got a particular press in mind, you know, I would encourage you to reach out to scholars in your field, senior scholars or not so senior scholars who have published with that press, and to get their perspective on it. You know, that's not necessarily just, you know, to pull favors. It's just to sort of get a sense of, you know, whom did you approach, which commissioning editor. I had a great experience with Cornell, which was, I initially approached the series editor at the time, who was Bruce Grant. The series sadly no longer exists, and the commissioning editor with whom I worked has retired. So in that sense, the information, my experience will be dated. I had a very positive, overall, I had a very positive experience with them. And one thing I think that's worth keeping in mind is that I had a positive experience sort of pre-publication, but I also had a positive experience post-publication. And I think that's important to keep in mind, you know, to what extent will a press help to promote your book? You know, make sure that it gets to conferences, submit it for consideration for book prizes and so on. And presses will have different, you know, you can see a lot of this stuff on their websites. You know, do they have a marketing department? How do they talk about, you know, the kind of work that they will be doing marketing your book? I've currently got an edited collection in production with Cornell, and I've again had very, very positive experiences with them, even though there have been a lot of personnel changes. And and of course it's very strong in the Central Asian field. So it's worth also thinking about presses that are right for your manuscript in terms of the other kind of texts that they've published. In regard to positionality, shame, and colonial, I mean, again, we could have, and I think we should have a whole conversation on this. And I know that it's something that's been going on, a lot of discussion on the Facebook group about sort of positionality, representation, who gets to speak for Central Asia. And I think it's incredibly important that we have these conversations. But I think it's one thing it's important to acknowledge the partiality of one's position and the limitations that imposes, right, in terms of one's capacity to understand and to understand another person's experience. But I think as an anthropologist, I would say that the discipline is grounded in the idea that it is possible to seek to try to understand another person's position with whom one doesn't necessarily represent in a straightforward sense, right? That anthropology it starts from an assumption that we can seek to meaningfully understand another person's experience or another group's experience, and to try to understand, the structures and the inequalities that reproduce certain forms of experience. So I don't know that in itself should be a barrier or a reason not to try to publish. I think it is a reason for us all to kind of be very to really think about the structures and to critique the structures of knowledge production. And in the field of Central Asian studies, that is a conversation that really needs to happen within the institutions of the Central Eurasian Studies Society, and so on and so on and so on, as I think many people in this group are extremely aware. And there've been I think really important critiques of things like the way that the book prize committee, the book prize sort of has worked in the past and so on. I think these conversations are extremely important, but I don't think the implication therefore that if one is not from Central Asia, one can't write about the region I don't think that's necessarily the most productive response. I think that there are ways to have kind of challenging and critical conversations that recognize and acknowledge one's positionality without feeling that one can't, therefore that one has no right to say anything.
Okay.
But like I say, I think these are topics
from the chat, and then I'll pull out some from the Facebook after this. Sorry, I thought you were finished. I'm sorry. So 3 questions from the chat. How to be politically engaged and working in the civil society organizations while still being able to write a book at the same time? Is it possible? What are your thoughts on that? Second question, is it okay to start writing a book before you finish your fieldwork? And we need to know like what is your discipline, but technically, that's what the person is asking. And they're basically saying that they're finishing their PhD at the moment, they cannot go back to the field and they don't want to waste the time. So should they try to focus on the book writing before finishing the fieldwork? And the third question is how to say no to a lot of other commitments. Yeah. Especially if your research deals with vulnerable communities and they're asking for the support for the projects that is related to your research. So it's about commitment to the field where we're working. So how can you separate from actions on the ground? Is it unethical? Would it be unethical to say how the research participants that, of your research as part of the common struggle for equality, but basically it's the question is how to say no to different commitments while writing.
Thanks again. I mean, we could have, these are great topics for whole seminar discussions, each of these things, I think. How to be politically engaged in civil society and write a book at the same time. I mean, I think one of the challenges there is that one is then inhabiting different personas in a sense, like a scholarly persona if you're writing an academic book, and an activist persona. But those don't necessarily need to be mutually exclusive, right? Any more than the fact that at 4 o'clock, I start being a mum and, kicking a football in the park doesn't stop me from, having a different persona at a different point in the day, right? And I think that question of the question of sort of carving time to be able to prioritize kind of intellectual work holds whether what we're doing in the rest of our day is teaching and prepping or writing recommendation letters and sitting on committees, or whether it's political activism, civil society work, and so on. It may be that there are different temporal parameters to those, and those impose different kind of pressures. But I think it comes back to the fundamental feeling of if there's a book in you that you sort of feel needs to be written and that you want that to get out there, that is valuable and worth doing. And that can be, you know, that those things, that doesn't need to be divorced from one's identity as an activist. You know, that one's scholarship can also inform one's activism, and one's activism can inform one's scholarship. So I think sort of thinking about, you know, again, the book that one wants to write to live as an object in the world, right? That's in a way the joy of a book, right? As opposed to a journal article. It takes on lives, it gets picked up, it enters sort of debates in all sorts of ways that we never expect. And I think sort of having that sense of, is producing that kind of object that I want to have this life. I want to get this stuff that I did, this research that is stuck somewhere. I want it to live, I want it to breathe, I want it to, you know, interact with people's ideas and their projects and their engagements and their criticisms. Is that something that you want? And if so, is that worth kind of carving out those little pockets of time to be able to work on it? In regards to the second question, and again, it's you know, the one that's very much constituted by these sort of pandemic circumstances, to write a book before finishing fieldwork. If you're trying to write a dissertation at the same time, my gut reaction is to say that's going to be really tricky, precisely because the kinds of style and the kind of organization of one's argument might be quite different for the dissertation. I mean, the dissertation often has quite sort of formal sorts of requirements that are different from those of a book. I would say in that case, it would be definitely something to consult with your supervisor or your academic advisor. I don't think it's possible to give a kind of...
Madeleine, sorry. I think the person told me that she's not actually the PhD student.
Oh, I'm sorry, I misunderstood then.
Yeah. No, it wasn't clarified, I think, in the question before. So that is why. But yeah, the clarification was that she is not a PhD student.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, but doing field work, yeah.
I see, but sort of, but to start, well, I guess in that case, it then is a question of, I mean, fieldwork in one sense is always a never-ending project, right? There's always more fieldwork that we can do. There's always that feeling that, oh, if I just stayed, you know, another month and did a few more interviews, you know, suddenly there would be that sort of, you know, golden egg of discovery. And I think recognizing that in a sense, the fieldwork is finite, and the book project then is you know, that there's a, you know, if there's enough to sustain, if you feel there's enough to sustain a book argument, and that's where your energy is, and you feel actually, rather than trying to sort of renew fieldwork or to restart fieldwork after the pandemic, actually to work with what one has, I guess that makes sense. Again, I'm wary of sort of wanting to give anything that sounds too absolute without knowing more about the specific context. And again, I come back to, this is where your community of scholars are really important. This is where having that sense that there's somebody who can be that sounding board about, is this a good idea? Is this a sound idea? And then saying no to other commitments. I mean, I come back to this. I have to say, this has been the hardest lesson for me personally. Like, I haven't, because I find it hard to say no to stuff, and precisely because I think that the questioner really puts this well, that there's kind of an ethical demand very often in those commitments, right? Particularly when those commitments or those requests come from people who, from whose presence we have benefited, you know, by dint of being able to, you know, do research with them and among them. So when I say no to things, I guess I had less in mind sort of saying no to the demands of people from your field site. Then there may be respects in which one has to be boundaried about or honest about, you know, what one can commit in terms of time or resources and so on. I was really meaning, I had in mind, I guess, more those multiple requests, academic requests that tend to happen as an early career scholar, right? It's very often that as a postdoc, you know, you present in a conference and somebody says, oh, can you contribute to my special issue? Oh, would you mind reviewing this book? Would you mind contributing an article to this special issue? Would you mind, you know, et cetera, sitting on this committee? And I think very often in the postdoc phase, one can feel, okay, I've got to say yes to all of these things because I might not be asked again and somebody will be offended if I don't, you know, agree and so on. And then you can find that your sort of entire time, in a sense, is consumed with these commitments. And that can leave very little time then one can feel kind of quite then sapped working on one's own work. And I say this is something that I've learned the hard way. It really, really, really is. So I guess that was more what I had in mind. And I think sort of maintaining commitments with the people with whom we did fieldwork is I think that's really important. But I think it does require sort of, you know, honest conversations about the limits of our capacities. And again, I come back to the fact that, you know, having people with whom you can have that community of solidarity who say, look, I'm in this dilemma. I've been asked to help, you know, so-and-so write this grant project in the place where I did fieldwork. You know, how can I do this in a way that doesn't sort of end up consuming all of my time? Or I've been asked to, you know, I don't know, teach this course in the university where I had affiliation during my fieldwork. I'm not sure that I can spare the time. Sort of having that community who can help you in each specific situation to sort of think about the ethics of those decisions and the limits of one's own resources and capacity and time.
Thank you, Madeleine. I think what I will do now, I will stop the recording because there were a few people who said they're a bit shy to say things while it's being recorded. So I think we do have quite a lot of material already here for, you know, for people to look.
And I'd also stress people can ask questions in Russian if that's more comfortable for them. Yeah.
So I will stop the recording and I think people can join in the conversation themselves. So we don't, I think, monitor the chat now.
Yeah.
And then, you know, they can just come in and then ask the question or comment. Yeah. So thank you so much, Madeleine. I mean, I'm stopping the